Alejandro Hernandez woke up that Friday with the certainty that nothing could happen to him go wrong. From the presidential suite of his skyscraper in Mexico City, he contemplated the city like an emperor modern. At 43 years, there were built an empire technological that spread by 3 continents, with actions in rise and covers of magazines that venerated him as the king of code. His wedding, scheduled for the next day, was the last seal of his perfection public. One ceremony transmitted live, with a model international as fiancé and a guest list that included ministers, actors, and CEOs. Everything was calculated, everything except the tremor he felt when his assistant, he mentioned, in a casual tone, that Carmen Garcia had confirmed his attendance, hadn't heard that name, from 6 years ago. Carmen, his ex-girlfriend, the only one who had bold leave it. In your moment, he played it as a betrayal, a offense unforgivable to his ambition. She said that I no longer had time to love, or that your true partner was the company, and perhaps had reason. Since that breakup, Alejandro did not look again back. Until now, send it invite, there was been an act cold, almost cruel. I wanted him to see what had happened lost, that he witnessed from a chair secondary, the perfect life that he there was built without it, but something in his chest tightened. Why there was accepted come. What I expected get appearing fair now. I didn't know. And what was it? Still further disturbing. By first time in many years, I didn't have the control. Carmen Garcia arrived the next day unannounced. She did not ask for escort nor special attention, simply appeared at the entrance to the lounge of the Hotel Peninsula, wearing a dress simple and one serene look that contrasted with the chaos media of the event. To your side, 3 5-year-old children, years they walked holding hands, identical to each other, and identical to Alexander. It was like see a replica in miniature of the magnate, multiplied by 3. The first one had he frowned and walked like a little general. The second was distracted with each flower of the road. The third was holding a plastic dinosaur in his hand, oblivious to the solemnity of the moment. The photographers at first thought it was a joke. Then the murmur became in shout, and in seconds, social networks exploded. Alejandro was receiving the ministers when saw he stir. At first, he thought some influencer had arrived uninvited. Then he heard his name. "They are your children," he shouted. "Someone, look at their faces." The world, it seemed, become slow. He moved forward among the flashes and the curious, until he saw her, Carmen, standing upright with her eyes fixed in him, and at his feet, 3 versions tiny of yes, same. She gasped for air. Carmen said nothing. She just bent down and whispered something to the children, who immediately, they walked towards Alexander with a naturalness disconcerting. The first one raised his hand and said, "Hi, are you Alejandro? Mum said you are our dad." The living room, which had once been buzzing with conversation, was in a brutal silence. Alejandro felt as he ground opened up beneath his feet. While he whirled whole, I watched the scene as if it were the unexpected end of a movie they believed predictable. If this scene touched you, heart, subscribe to the channel. This story is just beginning. Nobody knew exactly as react. The organizers, they tried continue with it protocol. The cameramen, they focused without knowing if they should continue broadcasting, and Alejandro's fiancée, Valentina Morandi, watched him from away with his face frozen. Alejandro didn't respond immediately. He looked at the children, then to Carmen. It was obvious. I didn't need DNA tests. Those children not only had their face, they had their gestures, their way to stand. Even that small grimace that he made by frowning, he frowned when was uncomfortable. "How is this possible?" he muttered. Carmen, without losing her cool, took an envelope out of her bag and handed it to him. "Here, there are the birth certificates and the letters that never you answered." He took them, trembling. He recognized his letter. He recognized the stamps. Dated letters year after year. 5 years, ignoring his existence. I tried tell you, Carmen continued in a voice firm. Aggression, I called. I wrote, I went to your company 3 times. A woman of your team told me that it was best to disappear, that you had elected you way. Alejandro blinked. Sofia Martinez? The same woman who had it guided from the beginning of his career, which led him to become the man that he was, had also been who decided who I had to be in his life and who doesn't. His heart was beating as Yair was under attack. His fiancée approached. At that moment, whispering something in the ear, but Alejandro I didn't listen to her. I had in his hands 5 years of a life that had been given to him, hidden. 3 children who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and excitement, and a past that returned as an unstoppable wave to destroy his control castle. The following days were a storm. Canceling the wedding was just the first step. The press international turned upside down about a scandal, the tycoon abandoning his fiancée in the middle of the ceremony, the apparent surprise of 3 unrecognized children, and the accusations against Sofia Martinez for obstruction of personal information. Alejandro did not immediately comment. He locked himself away in his apartment for 2 days without receiving anyone, without turning on his phone. In front of him, the drawings of the children, Carmen's letters, and the information doctors with their name as a biological father. He didn't cry. Alejandro wasn't a man who cried, but neither he didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He paced back and forth, reading the letters over and over. Time, imagining to those children growing up without him. It felt raped, not by Carmen, but by his system that he same there was built, one where all it had to be perfect, efficient, without unforeseen events. On the morning of the 3rd day, he called his lawyer and asked a meeting urgent with Sofia. She arrived safe, like always, without a pinch of guilt in his face. I did it by you, Alejandro, he said bluntly. Your brand needed a narrative clean. An unstable family, a resentful ex, and 3 children out of wedlock did not fit in that project. Alejandro listened to her without interrupting, without moving even. Then he asked, in a low voice, did you decide by me? Sofia tensed. I protected you. I was loyal. No, Sofia, you were cruel. You stole from me. 5 years with my children. He said goodbye. To her he acted, without raising his voice, with a firmness that was not there, used never with her. When he left the office, his assistant was waiting for him. Do you want me to prepare the press conference? Alejandro denied. No, I wish meet my children. Everything else can wait. You also. Do you think some moments change a life? Then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel. The first meeting intimate with the children were not in an office, neither at a social event. It was in a department modest where Carmen lived. In Coyoacán, she had insisted that he was there, without cameras, neither assistants. Alejandro arrived punctual, with a bag of toys that there was bought without knowing if were suitable, and a knot in the throat that reminded him of his earliest days, vulnerable. Carmen opened the door and invited him in. They are in his room. You can enter. The triplets were building a pillow tower. When they saw it, they stopped. Carlos was the first in speak. Did you come alone? Alejandro nodded. Yes, just me. Diego hid a little behind a cushion. Mateo looked at him attentively, as if I were to evaluate him. Do you know how to play hide-and-seek? Alejandro smiled shyly. I haven't played much, but I can try it. For the next 2 hours there was no talks, deep, neither explanations, just game. The children accepted it with a naturalness disarming. Alejandro let himself guide by they ran. By the hallway, he let himself be captured in a cushion ambush and even learned to distinguish between a triceratops and a stegosaurus. Carmen watched from the kitchen, in silence, sometimes smiled, others contained a tear. For her, it wasn't easy. There was passed by years of anger, frustration, and loneliness. But seeing them together, even if it was just for a moment, gave him certain peace. When the children fell asleep, exhausted, Alejandro stayed sitting in his sofa, looking at his little ones' faces. "Thank you for leave me come," he said without looking at her. Directly, Carmen sat down at her side. "I didn't do it by you. I did it by they." He nodded. He knew that Even had much to repair. In the morning next, Alexander took a decision that surprised everyone. His equipment manager asked a license indefinite contract with the company. He gave in temporarily executive control to his minority partner and asked not to be contacted by matters operational. "I am solving the most important part of my life," he said in a brief video call. No one dared to question him. Suddenly, the man who didn't allow himself to rest, not even a Sunday, was dedicating his days to learn to be a father. He signed up in parenting workshops, hired a psychologist childish to understand as integrate into their children's lives without causing them harm, confusion or harm, and began to visit them all the days. Sometimes they took to the park, others, sometimes I read to them stories or just watched them play. It wasn't perfect, it felt clumsy, but I was present, and that, to them, seemed enough. With the overtime, Carmen began to let her guard down. Not completely, but yes, enough to allow you to share Alejandro further spaces, relatives. He accepted that the pick them up from school, that they will take to his department after review strict environment, and even that they accompany him to the pediatrician. One day, Carlos asked him, could stay overnight with him. Carmen hesitated. Alejandro noticed and didn't insist. "Only when mother say yes," he replied. That answer, simple but full of respect, something changed in she. It wasn't him, same Alexander as before. He was not the man who controlled everything and everyone. He was a learning man to love unconditionally, to give in, to care without dominating. Carmen began to look at him with different eyes, not as a partner, but as a father to his children. And, although still it hurt, everything that happened was also beginning to emerge a possibility unthinkable. Rebuild something new from the pieces. Did you feel anything at this point? Maybe it's time to subscribe and keep following this story. One afternoon, while Diego was coloring a Tyrannosaurus with markers in the living room of Alejandro's penthouse, he looked up and asked, "Why didn't you live with us before?" The question, so direct and without rancor, left him paralyzed. "I didn't." Noah's explained to him the ego, the fear, betrayal silent that there was suffered. He knelt at his side and answered him truthfully simpler. "Because I didn't know you existed, but now that I know, I don't want to be far, nevermore." Diego nodded, as if, would accept he deal. "Then you have to learn how to make cookies with Mom, the ones on Saturday." Alejandro smiled, moved by logic childish that gave him a new chance, as if it were that simple as a recipe. That night, for first once, he dared to ask Carmen to stay and have dinner with them. She accepted. During that dinner, seated in a small table with colorful plates and glasses with superhero drawings, Alejandro felt further human than never. There was closed deals, billionaires, lunched with presidents, toasted in summits international, but never there was felt what I felt there, with hands stained with dough and children fighting by who broke the egg. Carmen watched in silence, with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. "You are not he same," he murmured. While they cleaned up the kitchen, Alejandro stayed in silence some seconds. "I want to be known, not as the Alejandro of magazines. I want you to know me. You too, yes, you can." Carmen didn't respond immediately. She looked at him with a tenderness reserved and said, "We'll see. But first, clean that flour off the floor. Here, he who cooks also sweeps." They both laughed. It was the first time in years that laughed together without tension. As the weeks go by, as they moved forward, Alejandro began to know not only his children, but also their routines, chaotic aspects of life every day. Dealing with tantrums because a toy broke, learn to comb curls, rebels before school, prepare fruit snacks that mysteriously nobody wanted. He discovered that Mateo had extraordinary intelligence. He memorized things with ease and made him questions about astronomy and numbers cousins who left him speechless. Carlos in change. It was pure fire emotional, protective with his siblings, defiant with the adults. Diego had a more contemplative, lover of animals, and with the imagination overflowing. Each one was different. Each one demanded a version different from him. And Alexander, accustomed to replying to a single successful model, had to learn that being a father was improvising and failing and returning to try more patience. One Sunday, while they armed a model of the solar system in a living room floor, Carmen approached with a file in his hand. "It's the school application. You have to sign it, if you are going to be part active." Alejandro took it carefully, as if it were a contract further important than any another. "I won't be in everything, from the start." Carmen looked at him with distrust, but also with a spark of hope. "It's not easy. Sometimes they get sick all at the same time. Sometimes you don't have it, neither 5 minutes of peace." Alejandro nodded. "It seems to me fair. I lived years without chaos, and it was empty." She looked at him, surprised for honesty. It was not the same man who had left crying 6 years ago in a coffee shop. Something in there was changed, and even though I didn't know Ye could forgive him completely, Yes felt that they could build something new, more honest, and less perfect. Alexander decided so, make a gesture. Concrete, bought a house in the suburbs, not a mansion, but a dwelling cozy with garden, rooms spacious and a kitchen where the children could bake cookies without restrictions. He showed it to Carmen as a proposal, not as imposition. It is not to separate them from you, nor to take them away. It is so that we can have a place shared, neutral, where they sit down at home with you or with me. Carmen visited his place with suspicion, inspecting each corner as Ye would search. A trap, but he didn't find it. It was a place made with intention, with tenderness. Even there was photos of the children in the Marcos. "Where from you took out are you?" "You." I followed in silence for a while. "After you were." It hurt, but I couldn't avoid it. I wanted to know if you were fine. Carmen didn't respond. She just caressed one of the photos. For the first time, he felt that he spoke from pain, not from pride. The move was made progressively. At first, they were just on weekends. Then, they stayed some days during the week. Alejandro learned to get up early, prepare lunchboxes, leave the uniforms ready. He started coming to school with dark circles under his eyes, like any another father. Sometimes he laughed with others, potatoes in line. Sometimes it felt ridiculous for not knowing how to tie a child's shoe. But the children were happy, and Carmen, although still maintained distance, I watched him with a look each time less defensive. One Saturday, while they collected leaves in a garden, Mateo asked him, "Dad, you and Mom, were you two boyfriends?" Alejandro nodded. "Yes, and I think you still are." "Us, we are knowing." Matthew frowned. He frowned. "And then can we be a family someday?" Alejandro looked him in the eyes. "We already are. We're just learning to be one." That night, Carmen stayed to sleep my first time. That first one. Night with everyone under the same ceiling was strange and beautiful. Carmen slept in a room separated, but the children, excited, did not want leave, not even for a second, to Alejandro. They finished all in his bed, squeezed between dinosaurs, colorful blankets, and half-read stories. Alejandro didn't sleep much. He stayed awake in the darkness, listening to the breathing soft of their children and thinking in as his life there was turned at an angle impossible. He remembered the cancelled wedding, the disappointed looks from his partners, the Sophia's silence when he kicked her out. None of that mattered now. At that time, with 3 small bodies wrapped up next to him, he understood finally the real value of time. No, the one who measures himself in minutes of meetings, but in bedtime stories and laughter that starts with tickles. The next day, he prepared his clumsy breakfast. Scrambled eggs, very salty, almost toasted bread, burnt, and juice served in cups. Unequal. The children celebrated it as if it were a feast. Carmen came down, and seeing it among disasters and crumbs, she couldn't avoid smile. Looks like someone took seriously that thing about being a dad. Alejandro looked up, with the expression between pride and shame. I'm practicing, although I still don't understand by that the bread has to be a little toasted but not too much. Carlos, with his mouth full, replied by, she, because so he does, Mom. Carmen approached and put her hand on his shoulder. You are doing well. It was the first time he said it. Alejandro didn't answer, but in its interior, that small recognition worth more than any award or magazine cover. It was, at last, a true beginning. If you are feeling it same, support us with your subscription. This story deserves to continue being told. Little by little, Alejandro began to share moments further intimate with each of their children, giving them individual attention. With Carlos, he built a car track that he occupied all the corridor of the new home. With Diego, she adopted a puppy rescued that the child baptized Cloud, and that he was sleeping in his pillow. With Mateo, he began to answer questions impossible with searches in books and videos. Sometimes Alejandro didn't know the answer, and admitting it was new to him, I don't know, but let's find out together, became in one of his phrases further repeated. The children, far from being disappointed, looked at him with more admiration still. Carmen watched in silence these efforts, recognizing in he to a man who had learned to fail with tenderness. He wasn't perfect, and just by that, for first once, it seemed to him reliable. One afternoon rainy, while Carmen was folding clothes in her sofa and the children they looked a movie, Alejandro sat at his side with a box. What is that? He asked her. A piece of what I was. Inside was newspaper clippings, event photos, decorations, conference credentials. I want the children know where from I'm coming, but I also want you to know in what am I doing converting. Carmen took a photo where he appeared in a gala with his ex-fiancée. And this, Alejandro looked at her calmly. That's a life that no longer belongs to me. She put the photo aside and stayed in silence. In that gesture, without words, Alejandro understood that perhaps forgiveness was not a goal, but a process. That loving was not about mending what was broken, but create something new from what remains. Carmen did not say more, but that night stayed until the children fell asleep, and so did he. In a school reunion, Carmen and Alejandro coincided by first time as parents officially recognized. The teacher, seeing them together, the greeted with a smile, warm, "Ah, you guys must be the parents of the triplets. They are a whirlwind of energy." Carmen laughed knowingly, while Alejandro, still uncomfortable with it title simply, he said, "Yes, they are ours." During the meeting, they talked about each other as progress. Child, Mateo stood out in logic, Diego in expression, artistic, and Carlos, well, Carlos had leadership. Sometimes too much, the teacher commented with a laugh. Upon leaving school, Carmen walked in silence a few meters and then said, "I'm thinking and quit my job. It's me costing drive everything." Alejandro looked at her. "If you do it, let it be because you decide, not by load. I can assume more." It was the first time she felt that he not only wanted to be on but hold. That same one week, Alejandro invited her to dinner, alone, without children. Carmen hesitated, but he accepted. The restaurant was intimate, away from the flashes and the circle business. During dinner, they talked as toward they hadn't done it for years. No agenda, no reproaches. They just listened to each other. Carmen told him, as was raising 3 children alone, how he feared that someone got sick and couldn't pay the hospital, how cry hiding so as not to scare them. Alejandro didn't interrupt. He just took her hand and said, "I missed so much." She squeezed the lips, and so did they. There was a long silence, but it wasn't tense. It was dense with truths that finally had space. At the end of the night, Alejandro didn't try kiss her. He just walked her home, waited for her to come in, and when he saw, Her closed the door. It was felt in peace. For the first time, I didn't need force anything. Everything was where I had to be. Following months were a mix of routine, surprises and new things, traditions shared. The children weeks began to pass you alternate between Carmen's house and Alejandro's, something that at first seemed complicated, but it became part of the family dynamic. Alejandro installed a board in the kitchen where each child wrote that wanted to do during his time with him, going to the planetarium, making cookies with Mom, although we are in your house, see a movie and eat at a floor. Alejandro fulfilled each wish with devotion. Sometimes it came late for commitments by stay a while, further Armando Legos, or helping with homework. School children, their partners. They began to notice that he was no longer the same. I had less time, less obsession by each business detail, but it also seemed further serene, more real. One day, in a board meeting, one of the investors, he commented in a tone mocking, "They say that fatherhood turned him soft, Alexander." He looked at him firmly, "Not soft, human," and I discovered that that is not a weakness. Some were uncomfortable. Others respected it. Still more, little by little, the image of the ruthless CEO was giving way to that of a leader close, accessible, changed policies internal of its company, implementing schedules more flexible, paternity leave extended, and play spaces in the offices. Carmen learned about those decisions by third and smiled. It's learning, he thought. He no longer judged him for what it was. I was beginning to admire him for what I was choosing to be. And the children, without understanding the scope of those changes, they just wanted it more. Because now Dad wasn't just there. He also listened, hugged, and let himself be beat in each memory game. One weekend, while we're preparing a play homemade in the living room, Mateo approached to Alejandro with a notebook. "Dad, I'm writing a history. Do you want read it with me?" It was a history simple, about a dragon that didn't know how to fly until a magician taught him that he could do it. Yeah, trusted in same. Alejandro read it carefully, and when he finished, he hugged his son. "She's beautiful. That dragon, that's me, isn't it?" Mateo shrugged, smiling. Carmen, who was watching from the door, he felt a knot in the throat. Seeing Alejandro in that dad role, present, sensitive and open to laughing at oneself, same was something that never imagined possible. It was like, the man who met does years finally had found his better version, not by success, but for love. Days later, Carmen received an offer labor in Monterrey. It was an important position, in a foundation educational with which always there was dreamed collaborate. The news caused a silence prolonged between them. Carmen was divided. It was his opportunity, but implied move in with the children or leave them with Alejandro for long periods. When she told him, he didn't try convince her to stay. He just said, "If you decide to leave, I support. If you decide to stay too, but I want them to decide together, you and them." It was the first time Carmen felt that she was not a negotiation, but a conversation between equals. Alejandro proposed an alternative. "What if we do something crazier? What if, come on everyone, can I work from there? I don't have it any more roots in an office, only where they be there." Carmen stayed mute. It was not a proposal impulsive. She was someone willing to reorganize his life for love. This time, without a master plan. Just the heart. Carmen did not respond immediately. She needed think, talk to the children, evaluate all without leaving Carrie for the excitement. For several days, he avoided her theme, focusing in his work and routines. Relatives, but the question floated in the air each time I saw Alejandro to help with dinner, read stories or carry school backpacks. Would it be able to trust again to the point of sharing a life together? Finally, an evening while they bent clothes in silence, she said to him, "I accept, but not because you asked me to. I do it because, for first time, I feel like we could build something from the same place." Alejandro didn't answer with words. He just looked at her with a mixture of relief and emotion that I didn't need explanation. They agreed that they would do his change in 3 months, so as not to interrupt his school year and plan the transition calmly. The move to Monterrey was a mixture of chaos and enthusiasm. Alejandro found a house near Carmen's work and a school with focus creative that fascinated the children from the first day. Adapting was not easy. New neighborhood, new routines, new faces. But they were together. Alexander installed his office at home and designed his schedules to be present in breakfasts, homework, and snacks. Carmen flourished in her new job, inspired, confident, happy. At night, when the children they slept, shared wine and conversations about the past, the present, and everything they didn't yet know about the future. None talked about getting back together as a couple immediately, but the darling, the respect and complicity had returned, and that it was enough, because had learned that they did not need hurry up. The family who were forming did not need labels, only presence, patience, and truth. One night, while Carmen was correcting information at the dining room table and Alejandro was putting together a cardboard spaceship with the children, Mateo approached with a ask unexpected. "Are you getting married? Other time?" Carmen looked up, surprised, and Alejandro blurted out a laughter, nervous. "Why questions that?" he asked. Because before they said they were boyfriends, and now always we are together, and you already know how to make cookies." The logic childish, relentless, the left her speechless. Carmen looked to Alejandro with a soft smile. "I don't know, son. Sometimes the adults need time to understand things." But that at night, as she went to bed, Carmen whispered to Alejandro, "Never there was sense that I had a real companion. If that isn't being into something serious, then I don't know. What is it?" He hugged her in silence, knowing that what is important, they already had it. The rest would come alone. If you ever felt that with someone, comment and subscribe. This story, it's yours too. As the months passed, his life acquired a rhythm. It was not perfect nor ordered, but it was deeply authentic. Alejandro organized science afternoons homemade with baking soda and vinegar. Carmen cooked recipes new with the children, although will end all bathed in sauce. They celebrated birthday with deformed cakes but full of love, and on weekends they did excursions improvised to rivers, parks or museums. Alejandro documented all with photos and videos, but not for social networks, for them, to save each instant like a treasure. One night, while they saw together one of those recordings, Carmen took his hand and said, "Never. I thought that the revenge of that invitation to your wedding would become in this." Alejandro looked at her tenderly. "Nor me. And it's a good thing it didn't work out as we plan." They laughed, knowing that sometimes errors further big open the doors further beautiful. One day Carlos had a strong fever that did not go down. Carmen was in a meeting out of town, and Alejandro had to take him to the hospital alone. He spent the night in a chair, uncomfortable next to the stretcher, worried, consulting the doctors and singing to him softly to calm him down. In the middle of the night, Carlos opened eyes and murmured, "I don't want you. Go, Dad." Alejandro caressed him. "I'm not leaving to go, never more." That one evening marked a before and after. Alejandro understood that he was no longer a visitor in the lives of their children. It was their refuge, his base, and he felt it too, so with them. It didn't matter how many meetings he lost or how many unanswered emails. None of that. Had courage in the face of the fragility of that moment. When Carmen arrived at dawn and found him asleep with his head resting in Carlos's bed, he knew that everything they had built was real. Pasts, nails, weeks. Alejandro was invited to an important conference international about innovation. It was the type of event where before there would have been shone, dominated headlines, shook influential hands. This time, he hesitated. He didn't want to waste a weekend with the children. Carmen encouraged him. Go. They have to know who their dad in all the senses. and you deserve it too. Remember where you came from, you come." Alejandro accepted, but he did different. In its presentation, did not talk about figures, neither trends. He talked about family, about how the algorithms did not save him from loneliness, how real leadership does not begin in the boardroom, but in the way a father listens to his children. The ovation was forceful, and although the cameras and the praise they came back, he didn't feel it vertigo from before. He just thought, "I want go back home." When he returned from the conference, he found the house decorated with drawings and balloons, handmade. "Welcome, Dad. Hero," said a badly cropped sign, but full of colors. Alejandro dropped his suitcase at the entrance and stood there with wet eyes. Diego ran to hug him, followed by Carlos and Mateo. Carmen the observed from the kitchen, smiling. How was he? He passed toward, she hugged her by the waist and whispered in her ear. Was in his scenery further important in the world? But nothing compares to this. That night, they celebrated with homemade pizza, laughter, and a badly projected film that cut out every time, while Alejandro wouldn't have done it changed by none. Gala banquet. Because by first time understood that the success is not measured in recognitions external, but in the quality of the memories one sows in the others. Some time later, Alejandro received a package by mail with no sender. Inside, there was a copy of the first letter that Carmen had sent him toward 5 years, the one that never came into his hands. It was open worn by time and accompanied by a note. "Never I should have interfere. Forgive me, Sophia." Alejandro stood for a long time with the paper in his hands. He didn't feel anger, just a deep sadness for everything he could have been different. But at the same time, I understood that if there were no past for that pain, perhaps there would not be arrived here. That night, without saying anything to Carmen, he put the letter in a box next to others' memories important. The first drawing of your children, the photo of the new house, a recipe stained with cookies, because understood that the past is not erased, it is honored, and that your history, although late, still was starting. The family began to have traditions own. Tuesdays were board game nights. On Friday we had something invented for dinner by the children, and the Sundays were exclusive for outdoor walks. Alejandro noted all in a notebook that she called Our Diary. One day, Carmen found it writing after the children fell asleep. "What are you writing?" "What I don't want forget." She skimmed some pages. On one, there were a phrase underlined. "Mateo told me that you don't need to be a superhero to be a dad. Just be there." Carmen closed the notebook carefully. "What if one day everything does this change?" she asked. Alejandro looked at her calmly. "Then we will have this diary to remind us who we went and who can to be again." They did not need promises eternal, just a present sincere, and that, for them, was enough. At school, the children, they should present a family project. Each student I had to carry a photo with the most people important of your life. Alexander proposed an image where appeared the 5 in last weekend's picnic. Carlos wanted a where we're dressed, as superheroes. Diego preferred one with the dog. Matthew, however, chose an unexpected, a blurry image where Alejandro washed plates and Carmen looked at him laughing. "Why is this it?" they asked him. "Because there they seem happy without doing anything special." Alejandro and Carmen looked at each other in silence. That photo, clumsy and unglamorous, was the reflection further honest about what they had built. One life where the extraordinary was in everyday life, where the scars of the past did not hinder but shaped the present, and where, without seeking it, they had discovered that true love doesn't scream, it just stays. That school project was a turning point. The teacher, excited for the presentation of the triplets, invited to Alejandro and Carmen to give a chat about the concept of family. "You represent something special," he told them. At first they hesitated, but finally they accepted. In front of parents and students, they spoke without script. From experience. Carmen told how difficult it was, raising 3 alone children with their identity fragmented. Alejandro confessed as ego and ambition had gotten the better of him, cloudy he heart. But they also shared how, step by step, they rebuilt something new. In the end, Carlos approached the microphone and said, I have 2 houses, but only 1 home, and it is where are the 5. The auditorium exploded in applause. Carmen and Alejandro held hands without planning it. It was a gesture spontaneous, but full of meaning. With the time, that history became known further beyond his community. Some media they wanted convert them in example, in success story emotional, but they resisted. They didn't want their intimacy became show. They just wanted live, follow celebrating birthday, facing diseases with hugs, and fighting by who would wash the dishes. The important thing, it was no longer the narrative public, but the history they built doors inside. Alejandro never. He became the tycoon he was looking for again, recognition in every step. Now, his greatest pride was when Diego hugged him from behind without warning, or when Mateo patiently corrected him while they did homework. Carmen, by his part, discovered that he did not need do it all alone. To let go control wasn't weakness, it was confidence. And by Alejandro's side, she no longer walked in fear, but with company. One Saturday, while organized a deep cleaning at home, Alejandro found in a drawer 1 box little girl who didn't remember have saved. Inside there was a photo, old one of him and Carmen, taken years back during an impromptu walk. They were both laughing, without posing, without tension. The image made it smile. He showed it to Carmen, who, upon seeing it, was amazed some seconds in silence. How much time we hadn't laughed yet? So, he asked. Alejandro didn't know what to answer. But that night, after putting the children to bed, children came back with the box and something else. It was the engagement ring that there was saved after canceling her previous wedding. Carmen looked at him in surprise. I don't want repeat he passed, he said. But yes, wanna ask you if one day you would like build a future with me. No press, no perfection, just us. Carmen didn't respond with words. She kissed him in silence. That gesture was everything he needed. They decided not to rush anything. They didn't put date, not announced commitments. They only began to live with the certainty that they were choosing themselves every day. The children, although still small, they understood that something had happened, changed. Now Mom and Dad love each other other time, asked Carlos once night. Carmen hugged him and replied, always us we wanted. Only sometimes the adults need time to understand it. The family continued growing in their rituals, in their challenges, diaries, in their small victories. Alexander became an expert in do braids, and Carmen finally learned to delegate without feeling guilty. Not everything was perfect. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they got tired, but they stopped talking. Never. They stopped looking at each other honestly, because they understood that true love is not the one that never fails, but the one who always returns. He who, even broken, chooses stay. In it, birthday number 6 of the triplets organized a simple party in the patio of the house. No castles, inflatables, neither clowns hired, just a long table with cakes facts by all, games invented by the children, and a wall covered with drawings depicting his family. Carmen and Alejandro, dressed in aprons stained with cream and flour, they coordinated the piñata while they laughed like 2 teenagers. Between the guests, some parents murmured, they have something special. And yes, they did. They had history, scars, mistakes, and redemption. They had a home, built from the rubble, and they defended it every day with simple actions, patience, tenderness, and a willingness to listen. That afternoon, when the children they blew out the candles, Alejandro made a wish, not for success, nor money. He only wished to have the wisdom not to repeat the mistakes of the past. That night, with the house already in silence and the children asleep, Carmen found to Alexander in a garden, looking at the dim lights of the lanterns. He sat down at his side. In the wooden bench they had restored together weeks back. "In what do you think?" he asked. In how we got here, in how something that started as revenge became the best part of my life." Carmen rested her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes you have to get lost to find what matters." He hugged her gently. "Thank you for not closing the door on me." She smiled, not looking at him. "Thank you for learning to play it different." They didn't need say more. In that silence shared was contained the whole story, the wound, the reunion, the transformation. And while the night was moving forward, they knew that even were left many chapters by right. But now, they would together. Sometime later, in an interview he accepted give to one small magazine educational, the only one who agreed to talk about her personal life. Alejandro summarized his history in a phrase that went viral. "The greatest success of my life is not measured in actions, but in laughter at the foot of a bed, childish." The phrase was shared by thousands of people, not by what it represented his figure public, but because touched something essential. There was many Alexanders there outside, people who had sacrificed relations by chase ideals of success. But there were also many stories like yours, with the possibility of redemption, if you had it the value of looking back and ask sorry. Carmen read the interview, in silence, in his sofa, while the children were playing. When Alejandro came in with popcorn newly made, she looked at him and said, "Maybe it was worth its share." "That," he shrugged. "I just told the truth." With the years, the children grew up knowing that his history was not typical, but deeply theirs. They learned that their parents separated, that they were reunited, and that they chose every step of the way without perfect formulas. Alejandro taught them to fail without fear, to ask sorry, look at the others, with empathy. Carmen taught them to resist without hardening, to take care of themselves, already trust even when the world seems uncertain. In his house, they did not punish each other the errors. They were spoken. It was not required perfection, it was valued effort, and each night before sleeping they repeated a custom that was born almost unintentionally. A phrase among all, one by one, until forming a chain. "Thank you for today. You, I want. I'm here. See you tomorrow." Alejandro, when turning off the light, used to be the last, and whatever happens, always together. One winter, during Nail's vacation with family in a mountain cabin, it became clear how much had changed everyone. Alejandro, who would not have been before offline not a minute of your world business, spent the afternoons building snowmen with the children and burning marshmallows in the fireplace. Carmen, who used to anticipate everything and control each detail, was now allowed rest, improvised dinners with whatever was available, and laughing if something went wrong. One night, while the snow was falling in silence outside, the five they played to invent fictional stories. Carlos imagined a superhero who saved animals. Diego invented a dragon that lived in a cloud. Matthew narrated a family of explorers who found a treasure hidden. When it was Carmen's turn, she said, "I want to tell the story of two adults who almost ruined everything." But what did they learn? To love different. Alejandro looked at her tenderly. Happy ending. No, real ending. That trip marked an invisible milestone. On the way back, the children, they began to call them Mom and Dad, without alternation, without confusion. They were no longer two worlds, two houses, two rhythms. They were one family in expansion constant. They decided, calmly and without pressure, to organize a small ceremony, intimate, without flashes or designer suits. Only them, and a few close friends, and a promise new, not of perfection, nor of eternity forced, but to continue choosing himself with truth. Alexander wrote his vows in a wrinkled sheet of paper. "You, I failed when I didn't know who I was. Today I choose myself better because you taught me to look different, and if you let me, I want continue learning with you." Carmen answered with her eyes full. "You are not the man I met. You are so much more, and for that, this time, yes, I accept." They kissed amidst applause sincere under a fig tree that the children decorated with lights. The ceremony was simple but deeply significant. Matthew officiated as master of ceremonies. Carlos handed over the rings after almost lose them in his pocket, and Diego closed. He act reading a picture with words that didn't rhyme, but that did cry to everyone. "Thank you for love each other so much, and for teach us that families take care of each other, even if they sometimes fight." After the yes, they ate chocolate cake made at home, and they danced a song that Alejandro didn't know, but that Carmen used to sing to them children before bedtime. No one recorded live, nobody published nothing. But in that celebration was all that mattered: truth, forgiveness, humor, and a bond renewed. That night, as he went to bed, Alejandro looked at Carmen and said, "Do you imagine, that wedding invitation would not have gone out?" She laughed. "Probably you would still be alone, and I still would be tired." They hugged strong. They knew it wasn't about erasing what came before, but about being grateful for it. The next day, Alejandro found the children playing The Company. They used boxes as desks and papers recycled as documents. Mateo was the boss, Carlos the assistant, and Diego pretended to be in a video call. Alejandro the noticed funny. "And me, I don't work here," Carlos replied seriously. "You are. He head of the family. You don't need office." Alejandro smiled. That phrase stayed with him all the day, because it was true. Although there was turned partially to its business, no longer lived by he. His true company was that family, that nucleus imperfect but full of intention, and in each decision no longer asked what would I do further powerful, but what brought him closer, further to they. There were changed his metrics. His legacy would not be his achievements, professionals, but the values that their children will remember when they will think in his name, and that, for him, was everything. If you ever felt that with someone, comment and subscribe. This story, it's yours too. They passed the years, and although life brought new challenges, the family remained firm. Carmen started his own project, educational, with a focus human-inspired in his own experience. Alejandro, for his part, founded the initiative to train leaders' business with family and emotional awareness. Their story was used as case study in universities, but he never showed as example. "I am proof that it can be done change, not that it should be do all as I." The children grew up knowing that his parents were not perfect, but brave ones, who knew make mistakes and also correct them, and that when love is real, it does not flee, it transforms. In each birthday, in each academic achievement, in each night of fever, Carmen and Alejandro were together or alternating but always there. And that, for the three brothers, it was the greatest security possible. When Matthew turned 12 years, wrote a letter for a school project. The subject was, "The person who most I admire." His letter began like this: "I admire my dad because you say sorry, and that does it further stronger than any hero." Alejandro cried when he read it, not from sadness, but from fulfillment. Years back, there would be sought validation in magazine covers or in conferences international. Today, some lines written in ink blue and spelling mistakes filled him the soul. Carmen, seeing his emotion, just hugged him. They didn't need say much. They were traveled a long road, full of curves, losses, and learning. But in the end, the essential had been saved, because when all it seemed lost, they chose listen, slow down, and look with different eyes. And in doing so, they not only recovered what they thought was broken, they built something new, more real and more strong, something that hopefully your children would also know, replicate someday. One night, after a dinner common, Carmen and Alejandro stayed on the terrace with a glass of wine. Heaven was clear and could be heard laughter far from the children seeing a movie. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked. Her, looking at the stars. Alejandro didn't respond immediately. He just leaned forward, thoughtfully. "I don't know. But we did it with the heart, and that, at least, leaves me sleep in peace." Carmen looked at him in silence. "I didn't need further certainties. In their lives there have been manuals nor predictable endings. But yes, decisions, brave moments, honest, and a willpower unwavering in not giving up. That night, there was no big revelations, neither promises. Just two people who, after all, had learned to stay, and they understood that the extraordinary was in not letting go of the hand when further. It gets difficult. Months later, Alejandro was guessed to write a book. They offered him figures exorbitant by count his history, but he rejected it. "My story doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to my children, and they still are writing." Instead, he began to write small texts just for them, one about as learned to do braids, other about his first mistake as a father, another about the time Mateo beat him in chess without leaving it win on purpose. Carmen, them I read. To hidden, moved, because I understood that those pages were further valuable than any biography. They were a living testimony of someone who had touched background, not by lose his empire, but by almost lose the essential, and that instead of make up his fall, there was decided get up his history from a dust with clumsy hands, but sincere. For Alejandro, that was enough. In one of those afternoon calm down, Carmen found in the library a folder with drawings and texts loose. They were the stories that Alexander wrote for the children, each with a date and a small dedication. In one, he recounted, as almost forget, Diego's dinosaur costume for a school presentation, and how, in the end, he ran in pajamas to the school to hand it in. In another, he described his first attempt failed to cook without the help of recipes. Carmen laughed as she imagined the scene. Each story was a confession and a gift, a way of saying, "I am here, even when I was not there." More. That night, without saying anything, Carmen hugged to Alejandro from behind while he washed the dishes. He gave himself lap surprised. "Is everything okay?" She just nodded. "Thanks for tell them who are you?" "No, Alejandro, the businessman. The one I know now." That connection silent was what held with him time. The big one's statements were replaced by gestures concrete, helping with tasks, taking care of others when got sick, respect the silences, knowing when speak, never. They did it again, promises of forever. They learned that the only real thing was what was built day by day, that love doesn't live on ideal plans, but on choices, daily. The children grew up among that honesty, and that's not what their parents idealized, admired, because they saw fall, ask sorry, and get up together. One day, while organized a box with memories school children, Carlos found the original wedding invitation that he never was. "What is this?" he asked. Carmen and Alejandro looked at each other and laughed. "A story old, that we made history good." Carlos didn't quite understand, but he smiled. He knew that whatever it was, there was finished well. If you're reading this far, it's because something moved you. Prove it's worth it. Subscribe now. Years later, with the children already teenagers, the family dynamics changed, but the essence remained. Now they argued about video games, homework complex, and choices personal. Alejandro and Carmen learned to let go control without losing presence. Sometimes the children were closed, others they shared suddenly, without warning. But they were there, constant, without judgment. One night, Mateo, now with a deep voice and a look thoughtful, she sat with Alejandro in her porch. "Dad, any time T regret how began everything?" Alejandro stayed in silence. "I regret not having known before what I know now, but not what we have today, because, although I arrived late, I arrived complete." Mateo nodded. "I want it too. Learn to arrive like this, even if I'm wrong." Alejandro hugged him. In that instant, he knew that more beyond everything, there was complement, its greatest mission, to form men with heart. Carmen, by his part, found a new meaning in a company to others women who, like she, had servant alone. They had loved with fear and had to be rebuilt without guarantees. Since his foundation, educational, promoted support programs, emotional, leadership, maternal and training in breeding conscious, his story was no longer a wound exposed, but a connection tool. When I shared his experience, I didn't talk about a happy ending, but rather a real process with setbacks and learning. Once, at the end of talk, a woman in the audience said to him, "Thank you for not telling a fairy tale. Thank you for show that it can be done. Heal without forgetting." Carmen smiled. I learned that late, but just in time. And while returned home, he knew that everything it was worth it, the difficult days, the nights alone, the years of waiting. Because that path, although hard, there was taken exactly where I had to be. In it, anniversary number 10 of that reunion unexpectedly, they decided do a small celebration just for them. Not a party, but a late at home with photos, old, letters and memories, writings by the children in napkins, notebooks, old and even loose leaves. Alejandro prepared a simple dinner with the same menu that one evening in which he cooked with the children by first time. Scrambled eggs, poorly toasted bread and juice in cups uneven. Carmen, laughing, served the special Saturday cookies. Seated at the table, the five they remembered anecdotes, they made fun of each other themselves and toasted with glasses different. So we don't plan, but we learn to care, Alejandro said. So it looked broken, but it became in home, Carmen completed. The children, already older ones, raised their glasses too, and in that toast, clumsy, noisy and warm, they sealed a decade of transformation, presence and chosen love. That night, Carmen and Alejandro were left alone in the living room, surrounded by plates dirty and laughter distant. "Any time, did you think we were going to get this far?" he asked. "Never," she replied. But neither I thought I could be so happy without controlling everything." Carmen looked at him tenderly. "And now that continue," Alejandro shrugged, "continue, living, follow, choosing us, day by day." There was no big plans, nor contract signed, nor scenarios dreamed, just a family that had learned to support oneself in everyday life. And for them, that was all they needed. Alejandro closed eyes for a moment, breathed deep and thought in the first time he saw Carmen with the children at the hotel door. Everything seemed a tragedy. At that time, there was been, in reality and the beginning of his true life. And I wouldn't change it, no reason. With the passing of the years, the children began to take their own paths. Matthew bowed for engineering, Diego for the arts visuals, and Carlos, to everyone's surprise, by psychology. Alejandro and Carmen, accompanied from a distance, fair, present but not invading. In each achievement, were there. In each fall, too. One day, Matthew said in voice high during a dinner, "When I have children, I want to be like you. Not perfect, but always there." Carmen was excited. Alejandro just smiled. They didn't need further tests. The sowing they had made, to your rhythm, had borne fruit. Not in the form of obedience, neither success academic, but in links strong, free and full of respect. And although they knew that soon the house would be further silent, they also knew that the echo of that history lived in each one of them. One afternoon, while Carmen was watering the plants in the patio, Alejandro approached her with a box. "What is this now?" he asked, she with a smile. "A new diary," he replied. "I want write about this stage, that of being parents of children who no longer need you. Let's hold hands. But yes, we are close." Carmen opened the box and found a simple blue notebook with the inscription, Chapter 2. She looked at him tenderly. "And you know how does it start?" Alejandro sat down at his side. "It starts with us. Here, doing what we did, accompany us." They didn't need securities, neither celebrations to follow being family. Their story had no end because it was not a destiny, but a way of being. And while the sun fell slowly over He Garden, they knew that the greatest success of their lives never was in what they planned. It was always in what they chose take care of. As the house was going emptying, the Sundays became in He moment favorite of the week. It was when the 3 children, already in their ways adults, returned home to share a meal, a chat, or just to be. Alejandro cooked with more skill now, although still continued burning the bread from time to time when Carmen organized board games, and laughter filled again the rooms that during the week remained in silence. Diego once commented, "When I have my own house, I want it to smell like cookies too." Saturdays. It was a joke, but also a promise to replicate what they were given. Alejandro heard him in silence, with a smile shy. I knew that was its true legacy. Not them achievements public, but traditions, small things that make someone want to return home, although no longer live in she. During a family reunion, Carmen projected on the wall some photos ancient. Among them appeared a blurred image of that day and the one that the children called him Dad, because first time. Alejandro looked at her with moist eyes, not out of nostalgia, but by gratitude. "That was the first time I felt I was where I should have," he murmured. Carlos, already adult, approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "And from then, don't you were more." It was true. Alejandro never returned to leave. He was in each moment, not with perfection, but yes, with constancy. That night, when everyone said goodbye, Carmen and he stayed for a while further looking at the photos. "Do you realize we did it?" he asked her. He hugged her. "Yes, but not how we imagined, but how we needed." And in that sigh shared, celebrated a real life full of mistakes, redemption, and lots of love. Over time, some things changed inevitably. Carmen had to have an operation knee. Alejandro started using reading glasses, and the children, they no longer asked bedtime stories, but advice for job interviews or partner decisions. But the bond continued intact, more mature, more silent, but just as strong. Sometimes it was enough. A look to understand the other, a gesture, a message, short. Alexander, who had started his life searching recognition in the outside world, now found your greatest satisfaction in those moments minimum. Seeing Carmen asleep with a book in her lap, listen to your children discuss about movies, feel the warmth of a home they built without a manual. I knew that the time was finite, but I also knew that every day lived with awareness, and love was already eternal. One afternoon, Alejandro received an invitation to give a chat in a university prestigious, this time accepted, but wanted carry with me to Carmen. During the presentation, she showed a slide with a single image, one photo of the 5 hugging each other in a kitchen between flour, laughter, and dishes dirty. "This is what saved me," he said, "and I don't mean to they only, but to what I learned with them. Be present, to make mistakes without fear, love unconditionally." The audience, he applauded. While standing, when he finished, a student asked him, "What advice I would give you to someone who has lost it everything?" Alejandro thought about it for a moment and replied, "Let him check it carefully. Sometimes, what we believe lost, he is alone waiting for us where we were not looking." And that night, while they were returning home, Carmen took his hand in silence. There was no more to say. The story continued writing. Carmen's health began to require further be careful with it time. It was nothing serious at first, but implied checkups, frequent, special diet, and some changes in the routine. Alejandro did not hesitate in fit all, cancelled, traveled, reorganized his schedule, and even learned to cook dishes, new ones that comply with the restrictions medical. "Don't do it just for me," he said to her. "I don't do it just for you. I do it by we," he replied. He, the children, already adults, also took turns accompanying her to appointments medical. or help with what is necessary. That network of care, woven during years of dedication, now it became tangible. It wasn't dependence, it was operative love. Carmen, sometimes frustrated due to its limitations, it found comfort in those gestures. And although he didn't answer her as before, the soul was serene. I knew it was deeply beloved, and that it was enough. In one of those afternoon calm, while Alejandro read to her in a low voice a chapter from a childhood book that they used to share with the children, Carmen interrupted him. "Do you think love can change a person for complete?" He lowered his book and looked at her gently. "I don't know, but I think it might help a person to meet who always wanted to be." Carmen smiled. "Then you helped me to find me, because never I imagined it would end so in peace." Alejandro kissed his forehead with eyes full. "And you taught me to let go he fear." Outside, the sun was setting slowly. Inside, the story continued weaving without the need for large turns, only with presence, with memory, with the invisible threads of two people who learned, finally, to live the same place, that of unconditional love. One morning, while organizing some papers at home, Carmen found the old box of the memories, the one that contained the first letters, drawings of the children, and that one wedding invitation that was never used. He held it some seconds, then placed it on the table and sat down forehead to Alejandro. "Do you realize everything we've been through?" He nodded in silence. It was a lot, and it was real. Carmen stroked the rough surface of the box. It seems that we saved this for the grandchildren someday." Alejandro smiled. "Sure. Let them know that their history began long before they were born, and that love is not always enters through the door, correct? But always find a way to stay." They decided, make a new family album, combining the old and the new. And while they cut, pasted, and wrote notes were given, realized that this was his true legacy, that same one. At night, Alejandro went out to the garden to close the gate and found Diego sitting in the hammock, looking his sky. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I was just thinking about as they achieved hold on." Alejandro sat down at his side. "We didn't always get it right, but we tried every day." Diego looked at him sideways. "That's more than enough." Father and son stood there in silence, sharing the stillness of the night. The moon shone between branches, and for a moment, everything, it seemed, arrested. Alejandro thought in the turns he took his life, in the mistakes that almost made it lose everything, and in as 3 children and a woman rebuilt it with her small hands and her immense love, closed eyes and thanked. There was no script nor formula, just one certainty there. It was worth it every step, every fall, each return, because now, yes, I was complete. With the passage of time, the roles were gradually reversed. The children, they began to take care of their parents as they had done before. Alexander, who had been the tireless protector, began to accept help. "Dad, I handle it," Carlos told him when we're leaving to some place. I'll go with you to the doctor," Mateo offered. Unprompted, Diego brought fresh bread made the Sundays, keeping the tradition alive although no longer lived at home. Carmen and Alejandro accepted those gestures with humility, understanding that love is also expressed in those small surveillance silent. The house, although further calm, she continued being a meeting point, a refuge, and each time that the 5 were meeting, although the bodies were others and priorities different, the heart of the home continued beating strong, just like the first day when everything changed. One day during after dinner, Carmen took the floor. "I want leave them something before they ask." He took out a folder with handwritten letters for each one, for Mateo, Diego, Carlos, and also for Alejandro. No one spoke. They just listened while he explained, "I don't know how much I've got time left, but I don't want to be remembered from sadness. I want you to remember the story complete and let them continue building from there." Alejandro said his letter without opening it, with his eyes full. I don't need read it to know what it says. Carmen looked at him tenderly. Read it same. You cost a lot. Learn to listen. There was laughter, but also silence dense with emotion shared. That one night, Alejandro read your letter alone in his study and wept, not from loss, but from gratitude, because I understood with complete certainty that even when time would begin to fail, the love they built, the would hold forever. They passed the years, and although Carmen's body turned further fragile, your lucidity and humor remained intact. It continued being the voice firm in the decisions relatives, the first in remember dates important, and the last in to give a hug. Alejandro, always at your side, there was learned to take care of it without invading, assist her without stealing from her autonomy. In one of its last interviews for a documentary about families resilient, they asked him which there was been his greatest achievement. Choosing stay when I was older, easy run away, he replied. That phrase resonated further beyond the camera. It was the truth naked of a woman who had loved unconditionally and rebuilt his home with patience, year after year, as who hand knits each thread. Alejandro, seeing her respond, felt his same pride that years back there was sense when he saw her standing at the entrance of the hotel with 3 children holding hands. In her last days, Carmen asked, be at home. I didn't want to hospitals, nor machines, nor cold lights. He wanted his plants, his books, the sounds of the garden and the laughter of her grandchildren who are already they ran by the hallways. Alejandro fulfilled each wish. He slept at his side in a chair. I read to him the texts ancients who wrote together and put soft music while evening was falling. The children were already adults, took turns being close, like a cycle complete that closed with tenderness. One afternoon, while Alejandro caressed her hand, Carmen whispered, "We did well, didn't we?" He, with a broken voice, replied, "Better than we imagined." She closed eyes with a smile, and when he left, he did it in calm, surrounded by love, by stories, by people who not only loved her, but who had learned to love because she showed them as. After Carmen's departure, the house seemed stopped by a few days. The silence became further heavy, the routines further slow. Alejandro passed some sleepless nights, walking by the hallways, playing objects that previously seemed common and now were loaded with memory, but he didn't let it sink. I knew she wouldn't want to that. With the time, transformed the pain in tribute, converted his garden favorite in a space community reading room for single mothers. With a bench that carried a single plate, here flourished true love, the children. They collaborated, adding ideas, planting new flowers, reading stories to the children from the neighborhood. Alejandro visited him each morning. He didn't speak, he just sat and listened. He wind, like if Carmen still were there, whispering in each leaf. And he deep down, I knew it was like that, because the love they built had not dead. There was only changed shape. Has there ever been such a phrase simple made you cry? If yes, subscribe. You are in the right place. One day, while organized papers ancient, Alejandro found the first letter that Carmen had given him written, the one that never reached him in his moment, but that he kept since he received it years after. He read it in voice high, alone, with voice trembling. When she finished, she wrote in the reverse, I understood it late, but I got it. He put the letter back and on impulse opened it, his computer. It started to write, not a business book, nor a speech for a conference, but history complete, with errors, with absences, with turns and returns. He did not embellish it. He did not omit the difficult. He titled it simply Carmen. And while I wrote, the tears they ran calmly. It was their way of speaking to him a time more, to tell him with finally mature words that what they experienced together was further bigger than any empire, was home, was redemption, was true. With the years, that manuscript became in a legacy silent. Alejandro didn't publish it, didn't show it to. editorials. He just printed it in 5 copies, carefully bound, one for each son, one for himself, and one he left in the garden bench with the Carmen's name engraved on the cover. For whom need remember that love is not always arrives on time, but can stay forever. So the dedication said. The children read it in moments different, with tears, with laughter, with respect. It was a history raw and beautiful, a guide without recipes, a mirror where each one saw reflected something of itself, same. Alejandro, seeing their reactions, felt peace because there was counted his true. And because, in doing so, he understood that this story did not end with Carmen. He continued in each decision that their children made, in how they loved each other, in how they let each other love. In a family reunion years later, one of the grandchildren, a boy with curious eyes and a smile naughty, asked, "Grandpa, how you knew that Carmen was the love of your life?" Alejandro looked at him tenderly. "Because when I lost her, everything else stopped having sense. And when I got it back, I understood what it was really love." The child hugged him without fully understanding, but moved for the answer. Carmen had gone. Physically, yes, but I was still present in each conversation, in each recipe inherited, in each decision taken with the heart. And Alejandro, already with the hair completely white and back further bent over, she continued being he. Guardian of that history, not to preserve it as a relic, but to remind the world, yes, same, that true love is not defined by as starts, but by as choose, stay, even when all it seemed lost. In one of his last birthday, Alejandro woke up with a decorated table for their children and grandchildren. They had cooked scrambled eggs, toast and juice in cups unequal, replicating her breakfast of that one first time with the triplets. Alejandro laughed with excitement at the sight. "This is a lot better than any gala," he said. Carlos, now a father too, hugged him. "We wanted you to remember where comes everything." Alejandro he watched everyone around, and at that moment understood that there was closed he circle, that what a time began as a strategy of control and revenge had led to the greatest act of love of his life. I didn't need more. It had the essentials. And every face in that table was living proof that his history there was left footprint, not because it is perfect, but by human. That night, sitting in his chair garden favorite, with the darling starry about Alexander thought in Carmen one time more. "We did it, love," he whispered into the air. "We did it with mistakes, but also with courage." He felt he wind warm stroke his face, and for a moment I would swear have heard his laughter. Closed eyes with a smile. I no longer had fear of the future. There was learned that life was not about avoiding falls, but about knowing how to get up with who decides to stay. And he had lifted up again and again time. And now, sitting among memories and surrounded by the family he built with love, Alejandro Hernandez understood the most important, that the true success is not what the world applauds, but what one is able to sustain, even in silence. And that, without a doubt, was his greatest triumph. From that day on, Alexander began to write small notes for each grandson, such as there was made years back with their children. Simple notes with tips, memories and phrases as "never underestimate a conversation at breakfast time," or "listening well is more valuable to respond quickly." He hid them among books, under pillows or inside drawers, knowing that one day they would be found. He didn't look for leave a monumental legacy, but small traces of love, traces of someone who had stayed present with intention. Carmen used to say that love is tested in the details, and Alejandro had made of that a practice constant. Each note was a way to continue caring, even when was no longer there, because there was learned that presence is not always measured by body, but for memory effective that we leave in the others. One autumn morning, Alejandro went out for a walk, how I did it every day. Greet the baker, water the plants, community members of Carmen's garden, sit for a while in his favorite bank. This time, however, he didn't return home. They found him calm, with a serene expression, view of the sky and a note in his pocket that said, "I'm ready. I loved you with everything I knew. Don't forget laugh, although it hurts. We'll see each other. In each, I remember." The news was received with sadness, but also with profound peace, because all they knew that Alexander had vivid as chose. There was loved, repaired, and taught to love. His funeral was not solemn. It was a celebration, as he would have done it dear, with homemade cookies, stories shared, laughter, and a video full of photos of the moments further absurd and beautiful of his life. Because he wasn't a statue, it was living history, and as such, would continue walking with them. After the funeral, the three siblings, they spent the night in the family home, sitting in the room where so many times had played, discussed, and learned. Matteo took out his notebook blue, where Alexander had started to write chapter 2. I only had some pages, but were full of reflections, simple and powerful. I didn't always know how to be a dad, but never I stopped trying. Carmen taught me that the silence is also language. If I were born again, I would choose his same chaos with them. Carlos read in voice high one of the last passages. To love is not to have reason. It is to stay when we no longer know that say. The three of them stayed in silence. Then Diego proposed what would be a new tradition. Every year, on the day of his birthday, we come here and we write a page more. So he diary, it never closes. The other two nodded, because they knew that was what Alexander would have done. Darling. With the time, the house became in a meeting place, relatives regular. The grandchildren, they played in his same garden where Alejandro and Carmen met again. The recipes followed, passing from generation to generation in generation. Photo albums were expanded with images. New, but always there was a special section for the beginnings, for that wedding that never was, and for everything that arose from it. Alejandro and Carmen's story was told without embellishment, with its contradictions, its mistakes, and its redemptions. It was told not to glorify them, but to remind us that to love is to choose every day, even when it's difficult, and that sometimes the stories that don't start well are the ones that are most deeply transform. In that house, no one was looking for seem perfect. It was just a search to remain, and that, in the end, was always the teaching further valuable that they left. One rainy afternoon, one of the grandchildren found the old video of the party where Carmen and Alejandro renewed their vows under the fig tree. They showed it in the living room, improvising a family cinema. On the screen, you could see the children, further little ones, running with lights in their hands, and Alejandro saying, "I don't promise perfection, I promise presence." The voice trembled in the speakers, and although many already they knew that phrase, he played again, he heart of all. The most smallest of the grandchildren, sitting in a lap of his mother, asked, "Does grandfather still see?" And Carlos, with a soft smile, replied, "If you close your eyes and you think in something good that he taught, yes, you this seeing." Because that was Alejandro in their lives now, a silent beacon, a loving guide, that followed, present in the decisions, in the gestures, in the words they repeated without realizing it account. With the years, the garden community was transformed into a landmark for the city. Not for his size, neither by his design, but because of the story that sustained it. Many single mothers, they came over there searching consolation, advice, or simply company. In a small side booth, there was a mural with a phrase handwritten, "Here flourished true love." Nobody passed by there without stopping for even a moment. Alejandro's children maintained that space with devotion, knowing that it was not only a tribute to their mother, but a symbol of what can be built when chosen fix in instead of fleeing. Every tree, every bench, every plant carried a history, and in the midst of it all, the original bank remained there, intact, like a witness silent of a story that began with distance, continued with pain, and ended transforming many lives, including yours. Once, a month, The family organized a dinner open in the big house. Friends, neighbors, exes Alejandro and Carmen's colleagues were welcome. No one stayed. Outside, it wasn't an obligation, but a celebration of life shared. In each, I meet someone counted an anecdote Alejandro's news, how it helped him in silence, how did he do it laugh in a worst day, how it unintentionally inspired him. Those stories weren't glamorous, but they were deep, and in each one of them was repeated a constant. Alexander had stayed present, not with large speeches, neither gestures exaggerated, but with time, listening, and generosity. And so, your legacy was still alive, not as a memory static, but as an energy in movement that was replicated in those who knew him and in who had only heard his history. One night, at the end one of those dinners, Mateo was left alone in the kitchen, washing plates. He found an old paper glued on the inside of a cupboard. It was a list written by Alejandro with things he wanted or estimated. I want. 4, time is the greatest gift, expensive. 5, don't procrastinate the games. Mateo stayed in silence, reading one and the other time. Then he carefully tore it off, laminated it and hung it up at the entrance of the house, not as decoration, but as compass. Because I understood, as all in that family, that true love doesn't need big gestures. You just need intention, and that the people who learn to love with effort leave brands that last more than any statue or recognition. Alexander was one of those, and for that, it never really went away. One day, during an interview at Carmen's foundation, Carlos was asked how defined love. He did not hesitate. Love is when someone decides to stay and build with you, although have 1,000 reasons to leave. He then explained that this definition had it learned seeing them to their mother who never he stopped protecting, his father who chose change for love. That phrase circled through social networks and reached places unexpected. But for Carlos, the important thing was not the impact, but that his children and nephews also grew understanding that loving is not just feeling, it is acting, and that sometimes act more radical love is to ask sorry. So as Alexander did that late in which your world fell apart, only for it to later discover that the best of your life barely was starting. Every time the family incorporated to someone new, a partner, a friend, a child adopted, they told the story from the beginning, not to repeat it as a myth, but to explain the basis of everything, that the home they built was born of error, but sustained by truth. No one in that family was afraid to make mistakes. They knew that making mistakes was part of the journey. The important thing was what they did after. That's why, when some failed, it was heard a phrase repeated from the Carmen's times, "It's fine, but talk, stay, repair." And so, generation after generation, what there was started with one cruel invitation became in an inheritance emotional connection of incalculable value. Alejandro did not imagine that by inviting Carmen to that wedding, he was opening the door to his greatest transformation. But he did it, and for that, until the last corner of that house and of those lives was impregnated with its history. In a letter that Diego found years later, stored among the books of Alexander, there were a reflection that they did not know. If I could talk to Alejandro from a while ago, 20 years, I would say, "Let go," he cried. "Listen more. Look at Carmen as if it were the only one it's really worth it hold, because it is." That phrase moved him deeply. He read it to his brothers elate, and everyone they coincided in which that was the root of everything. Learning to look at the other with depth. Carmen was the compass, Alejandro the navigator who dared to change course, and they, the fruits of that courage, shared. Since then, they decided post the edition deprived of the letters and reflections of her parents, not as tribute literary, but as living learning material. They called it "We Stayed," because that was always the verb that held. Years after, in a class university relations human, one teacher, he mentioned the story of Alejandro and Carmen as example of resilience effective. One of the students raised his hand. They do. They really exist. The teacher, he smiled. There are in each family that chooses speak, stay, and rebuild. Then he said that he had met one of the grandchildren in a conference about Link's relatives, and that her testimony had moved more than any theory. Because love, when worked on day by day, leaves roots deep. And Alexander, although he did not seek recognition public, became in symbol silent about what it means grow emotionally. Since a story that could have been left in pain, he chose a redemption narrative, and that, generation after generation, continued playing lives. Although many would not know his name complete, they felt his legacy in each decision made with love. In the old family home, already converted in cultural and meeting center community, there was a room reserved as living archive. There were kept copies of the diary blue, letters from Carmen, photos, and objects, symbolic of the family's history. It was not a museum, but a space where people could sit, read, cry, write their own stories. Every now and then, someone left an anonymous note in a little box at the foot of the original bench. Thank you for teach me that it is still possible return. I returned with my daughter after years. Today, I spoke with my mother for first time in a decade. Those messages were the sample further clear that what has been experienced for Alejandro and Carmen, it had not been left on its walls. It had been converted in mirror, in bridge, in permission for others. And in a society that fears so much show fragility, that space was a beacon. Carlos, now a grandfather, visited that center each month. He sat in the bank, read some notes, left flowers in Carmen's corner, and sometimes simply closed the eyes. One afternoon, one young man approached him and asked him if it was true everything there was read. He nodded. Everything. Even what seems exaggerated. Because love, when it is real, has something of a miracle about it. She sat down at his side and cried. Carlos didn't ask anything. He was just there, as they taught him, and in that silence shared, understood that his family's legacy was not a history ancient, but a present way of being. Because when someone learned to really stay, that lesson multiplies. And so, while the world continued spinning, the story of Alejandro and Carmen, born from error, nourished in love and sustained with patience, continued writing itself, a life at a time. In a special occasion, the city organized an event to recognize figures that had contributed quietly to the community. Alejandro's family was invited to receive a mention honorific, not by his company, nor for their achievements economic, but by the impact human that his history there was generated. They went up on stage without speeches prepared. Carlos took the microphone and said, "Our father was not a hero from his start. It was someone who chose change, that decided stay, and that we taught, with his example, that love is work diary, not destination magical." The entire room gave a standing ovation, not because of the solemnity of the act, but for the truth raw than all they recognized, because every person there, in some moment, had to decide between fleeing or staying. And seeing that someone there was elected he path difficult, and there was sustained, gave them strength to continue his. After the event, an older woman approached Mateo with a smile, excited. I worked with his father a while ago, many years. He was very distinct then, cold, precise, brilliant. But now I understand, never was bad. I only had fear, and you helped him let it go. Mateo hugged her wordlessly, because yes, that was the truth. Alexander had been many things, ambitious, controlling, absent, but there was also been able to disassemble and start over. And that kind of transformation isn't taught in schools. You live, you choose, you cultivate. That is why, while the world changed to his around, the Alejandro and Carmen's children continued repeating, generation after generation, the greatest lesson they received. When love is true, it does not seek punish the error, but fix the damage. And in that repair, beauty is found further durable. In it, anniversary number 30th of that day, in the one where Carmen appeared at the wedding with the 3 children, the family organized a celebration private. There was no intention of making a grand tribute, but yes, to remember with gratitude. Reunited in he garden that sometime was he refuge of both, they hung photos ancient among the trees. They read diary fragments blue and prepared the recipes that marked his history. Saturday cookies, scrambled eggs clumsy, the birthday cake improvised. At the end of the afternoon, each grandson shared an anecdote with Grandpa Alejandro. Some were funny, others deep, but all had an element common: your presence. Although it was no longer there physically, everyone they felt that it continued there. In their gestures, in their decisions, in the way they hugged each other without fear, like he taught them. That night, after the meeting ended, Matthew was left alone under the fig tree, with the diary blue in his hands. He flipped through it a time more, stopping in a phrase that his father had written. In one of the last pages, "I didn't know how to love right away, but when I understood, I loved with everything." He closed her notebook gently and placed it at the base of the tree, like who returns something to its origin. He looked at the sky, stared, took a deep breath and murmured, "Thanks, Dad. It wasn't just gratitude for what I have experienced, but by everything that had been sown. Because in that history had not perfect heroes nor fairy tale endings. There were humanity, humility, and the courage to stay. And that, in a world where all pushes to flee, it was the revolution further great that Alejandro Hernandez had achieved, a revolution silent, woven with true love." The years continued his course, and the story of Alejandro and Carmen began to be told also in schools. Not as biography, but as learning story, emotional. Teachers used it to open discussions about family, regret, second thoughts, opportunities. In a class, one little girl, he raised his hand and asked, "Why, someone, would you wait so long to do the right thing?" The teacher, moved, replied, "Because sometimes understanding love takes time, but it's never too late if you decide to act." And so, the seed of that history continued germinating in lands new, not like doctrine, but as inspiration, because he didn't talk about success immediate nor gestures heroic, but of the everyday, staying when possible, run away, talk when it is difficult, to return when it hurts. No, that was the lesson, and so that, each time more people made it their own. In a bookshop small center, someone left an unsigned book in the self-help section. On the cover it said simply, "We stayed." The owner of the establishment looked through it, intrigued. Inside was short stories, phrases loose, reflections on life. I didn't have visible author, but whoever read it felt that every word was written with truth, with years of pain, tenderness, and understanding behind. The bookstore decided print further copies and place them in a special section, readings for when he heart doubt. With the time, that book it circulated from hand to hand, crossing cities, countries, languages. And although nobody knew exactly who had it written, all felt like they knew the author, because in the end, We Stayed wasn't just a title, it was a statement, a way of life. A flag for those who, despite everything, still, they think it's worth it stay and love with. Intention. If you're reading this far, it's because something moved you. Prove it's worth it. Subscribe now. In one of those specimens, anonymous members of We Stay, a young mother found comfort in the middle of a painful separation. I read each evening a page, like if it were a conversation with someone who already there was traveled that same abyss. One night, he wrote on the last page, "Thank you for teaching me that I can return to start. It's not too late. To be a mum present is also a form of love." He left that book in a train station with a note, "For whoever needs it." Days later, another reader wrote on the back cover, "Today I spoke with my father after 20 years. And so, the book continued his road, repairing links from his anonymity, as a legacy silent of those who they learned to love with truth and without a manual. Meanwhile, At the family home, now converted in family shelter in transition, the original essence was kept alive. No embellishments luxurious, neither speeches motivational, only spaces real, where people could arrive broken and start over without fear. On one of the walls, there was a phrase graffiti by a group of children: "Here, nobody is perfect, but everyone can return." Carlos, Mateo, and Diego maintained that place with the same dedication with which Alexander maintained his family. And although each one had his own life, they returned to that center regularly, knowing that there began everything. And because they understood that the most valuable that they inherited was not a house nor a company, but a way of being in He world. And that way of staying, repairing, and loving unconditionally was still alive in each corner, in each history, new arrival to start over. One day, a journalist Young wanted to make a report about He Center. He asked could interview the founders, and Carlos accepted with the condition: "We do not want fame, only the truth tells." During the conversation, she asked which was the turning point for his father. Carlos thought some seconds and replied, "When we looked by first, sometimes not as an interruption in his agenda, but as his priority." The journalist was left in silence. Then he asked by Carmen. She was the root of everything, the one who never released, the one who believed in what did not yet exist. The report was published weeks then with him title, "We Stayed," the story of a family that transformed the pain in refuge. And, although the family did not seek recognition, they arrived at the center by that note saying, "I read his history. I want learn to stay too." Among those visitors, a middle-aged woman approached Mateo after a chat. They forgave everything?" He looked at her kindly. "No, but we learned to move on, even with what is not forgotten." The woman broke in crying, "Then still I have time." Mateo took her hand. "If you are here, already you started." That was always the heart of the story, not to offer perfect endings, but paths royal. Not to demand that everything heal, but demonstrate that even with the cracks, it is possible build something beautiful. And so, Alejandro and Carmen, without intending to, left the inheritance emotional that multiplied courage, because they chose to stay, yes, but they also chose transform, open up, ask forgiveness, sustain. And in a world that applauds the immediate, they taught that what lasts is built in day-to-day with silences, hugs, and the will firm in not giving up. Years further afternoon, one of the grandchildren, already adult, wrote a message in the garden mural community. "My grandfather taught me that love is like an old bench, firm even though crispy, and sitting next to someone in silence is sometimes worth more than 1,000 pieces of advice." That phrase was left there, painted alongside children's drawings, dried leaves and new flowers. Because that garden never, it was a place solemn, it was dynamic, alive, imperfect, like the story that gave it origin. Each visitor I found something different, an echo, a track, one inspiration. Some they returned frequently, others just passed by, a time. But everyone, they left something, because they understood that it was not a place to admire. It was a place to remember that it is still possible, build something good with what remains, and even what begins from pain can flourish if there is intention sincere. In a meeting intimate by her birthday number Carmen's 90, although was no longer there, the family gathered to tell anecdotes that had never been told before, said, between laughter and tears, they revealed old letters, jokes, private, memories that had left in each one's memory. At the end of the night, they placed a new plate in the garden bench. To Carmen and Alejandro, for teaching us that love doesn't need start well, you just need to be chosen each day. Carlos took the floor and said, today we are no longer here to tell his history. We are here to continue it. And everyone understood, because that history, with its origin clumsy and his root brave, it was not their property. It was a guide, a map, living proof that even when all seems break, love if it is honest, can build from the ruins something deeply eternal. With the time, generations further youths, they began to take the natural lead from what their grandparents had planted. They didn't do it as a weight, but as a free choice. In their own relationships, in their jobs, in their friendships, they replied attitudes they learned from observing Carmen and Alejandro, listening before reacting, staying despite pride, speaking up although it hurt. One of the great-granddaughters, only 9 years, wrote in a homework, "In my family, everyone they know cry and stuff, it's okay." When his teacher shared that phrase with the parents, Diego smiled and said, "That is the inheritance further strong that we have," because they knew that the true legacy was not there in the properties, neither in the accounts banking. I was free emotional that they learned to practice and to teach. In that family, feel never was a weakness. It was the home language. One day, a major publishing house wanted Convert History complete in a movie. The family debated it during weeks. Some they feared that it would be distorted. Others they thought I could inspire still more people. Finally, they agreed a condition non-negotiable. We don't want a perfect story. We want a history honest. The script was supervised by all, not deleted the errors, nor were the decisions embellished. It was shown the abandonment, clumsiness, the selfishness, but also the will to repair, the dedication silent, the beauty of staying when nobody expected it. When the film was released in a small festival, he did not win prizes, but tears sincere and long, hugs between strangers, people leaving the room calling to someone, writing messages, repeating phrases that had heard on the screen, because that history, although born from two real people, already it didn't belong to them. It was part of the world. Now, after he premiered, many visitors, they began to arrive at the center community with questions, with tears, with letters in hand. Some they wanted confirmed that everything was true. Others simply they wished say thank you. On an empty wall in the garden, they began to leave messages written with marker. I also decided stay. I came back to hug my son. I forgave my father. Alejandro and Carmen's children and grandchildren decided not to erase them. They understood that the wall wasn't vandalism. It was testimony, it was life in transit, and with it time, that corner became the heart of the place. Because over there were the marks of those who they understood the essence of the message. It is not about never not to fail, but to not give up, to stay when the impulse is to leave, to reach out even if there are no guarantees. Alejandro did it late, but he did it, and that it was enough to change it all. In one of those visits, one woman with gray hair and gaze, he firmly approached Carlos and said, I met Sofia Martinez. I worked with her. Does many years. I never knew what he did. Carlos listened to her respectfully. We didn't know either until it was late. The woman, he looked down. I find it hard to forgive something like that. Carlos took a deep breath. We do too. But we learned that keeping hate only spreads damage, and no one is cured by punishing. The woman cried in silence, and before leaving, he left a flower white in a Carmen's corner. It was the first time someone connected with that part, silenced from history. And so, even the unspoken, the unresolved, also began to find a place. Because true love doesn't erase the darkness, it acknowledges it, it embraces it. And from there, he decides to continue. With the passage of time, the book, We Stay, began to appear in hospitals, prisons, shelters, rural schools. It was not part of campaigns' officers, no planned marketing. It was a phenomenon human. Each copy was passed from hand to hand like an object sacred, and in each place, history found new interpretations. A doctor wrote, in her margin, I returned home after 10 years old, a teenager arrested by heist. He underlined a paragraph and wrote, today I understood that asking sorry doesn't make me less of a man. A rural teacher used it as teaching material empathy. And so, without advertising neither strategies, history continued living, crossing borders and touching souls. because what Alejandro and Carmen built wasn't just family. It was a language, a pedagogy of love, an invitation to make peace with oneself and with others. On a special anniversary, the family organized a ceremony, intimate in front of the tree that Carmen and Alejandro had planted in his first year, like grandparents. It was already leafy, firm, with branches that shaded everything he gardened. The great-grandchildren, they hung up messages between the leaves. Thank you for teach us not to give up. I want a love like he yours. Now I know that staying is also growing. Mateo took the floor with a voice, excited. We are not a perfect family. We never were, but we are a brave family because we dared to look at each other, to speak, to stay. There was applause, soft, tears restrained, and long hugs. Alejandro and Carmen were no longer there in body but in each one of those gestures, because when love has been sown with truth, it does not need monuments. Live in the way we try, in the way that, even in the pain, we decided. Stay. One afternoon, one of the grandchildren, now teaching university student, proposed to his students write a letter to someone they would love recover. The instruction was simple. It would not be sent, but I had to write to each other with complete honesty. Upon reviewing the letters, he found phrases that reminded him his childhood. I'm sorry to have me away. You strain, although I never said it. I want return. Yes, you want too. That night, when he got home, he took a notebook and wrote a note for your future ones. Children, if any time we failed, I want you to know that even can return. In this family, we don't reward perfection. We celebrate he attempt. He kept the note in a box, along with a photo of Alejandro and Carmen hugging, because understood that the cycle did not end with them. It continued in each gesture, in each word, in each new decision to stay. It was a legacy that no longer depended on a surname. And it was a philosophy of life. In a corner of the center community, someone let a stone painted with the word sorry. No one knew who placed it, but nobody took it away. With the time, others' stones were appearing to his around. Listen, hug, breathe, repair. A small improvised altar was formed which people began to visit. He had no rules, neither schedules, just intention. Some people were crying there, others left notes, and many they just sat down. In silence, one day a little girl asked that meant all that. His mother replied, it is a place to learn what we do not know, teach at school. Because in that corner of stones and memory, no one was venerated. An act was honored, deeply human, that of recognizing the wound, approaching the other and deciding, with everything he fear and love possible, staying to heal together. Carlos, already with him, hair completely white, passed by some afternoon guiding young people in family reconciliation processes. It was not presented as expert nor gave formulas. It only counted his story and listened attentively. Once, a young man asked him, how I must stay or go. Carlos calmly replied, he's not going to tell you. A sign. But if when you think in stay you feel peace, even if it is with fear, then listen. That phrase was written later on a mural in the center, along with so many others who had borne from the testimony of his family. Alejandro and Carmen had been two ordinary people, with serious mistakes and successes redeemers, and yet, with their decisions daily, they left a mark so deep that generations whole followed drinking from it. I don't eat myth, but as a beacon. One day, while checking his old notebook blue, Diego found on the last page something that never had seen, a phrase written in letters different. It was Carmen's. Thank you for stay, even when I was older, easy not to do it. That line did it cry in silence, because summarized everything, the pain, the waiting, the choice. That phrase became into a mantra for the family. They printed it in markers, notebooks, and hung it above the entrance to the center community. It was a reminder diary that the true love is not proven when all it's okay, but when put to the test. And that does not do you need to be perfect to deserve it a second opportunity. Makes lack of courage and will. What Alexander found when I had nothing left to prove, just everything by repair. And finally, he repaired it years after, when the great-grandchildren already were adults and began to form their own families, organized an exhibition with objects, writings and photographs that told the story of Alejandro and Carmen. They did not present it as a romantic love story, but as a brave love story. There was a display case with the original invitation to the failed wedding, another with drawings of the triplets, one more with the diary texts blue, and even one reproduction of the garden bench. The exhibition was titled, "We Stayed, the Courage to Rebuild." Thousands of people visited it, many leaving tears, letters and reflections in a mailbox at the end of the route. The most repeated, he said, "Thank you for reminding me that even I can return." Because history there was transcended its protagonists. Now it belonged to everyone, to those who failed, of whom waited, of whom they didn't know yet. Yes, stay or leave. Matthew, during the opening speech of the exhibition, said something that remained recorded in memory collective. Our history is not important because it ended well. It's important because could end badly, many times, and even so we choose continue. Each one, with fear, with doubts, but with love. That phrase was repeated in articles, social networks and classrooms, because he named something essential, that the extraordinary thing about Alejandro and Carmen was not his final union, but each micro-decision, daily stay when I was older, easy surrender, in every hug after a discussion, in each silence that was not filled with screams, in each breakfast improvised, in each history told without filters. That's what I did, that everyone would like return to that history one and the other time, because it gave them hope, he gave them permission, and I reminded them that even in chaos, it can be done to sow something deeply beautiful. With the time, "We stay" also became a practice. In some homes, hung the phrase at the door as reminder. In family therapy centers, therapists, they used diary fragments blue as conversation material. And in schools were created projects for the children write their own letters of reparation. Alejandro and Carmen were no longer names known to all, but his history continued transforming realities, because he didn't talk about solutions not magical, but of humanity in pure state. Fail, doubt, hurt, and still. So have the courage to return, to speak, to look at the other with new eyes. Every corner of the center community was breathing that energy. It was not a place to admire stories other people's. It was a place to start one's own. In a final conversation between brothers, many years afterwards, Carlos asked Mateo, "Do you think that Dad knew the impact that would cause his transformation?" Mateo smiled. "No, but he didn't need it either. He changed by us, not for he world." That phrase he circle in a perfect way, because Alexander he was a hero public, nor a martyr. He was a man who chose face their mistakes and act. And Carmen, far from being just a figure patient, was he heart firm that knew weight without idealizing. Together they built something that, with the time, it stopped being only his, and that, in his background, it was what everyone they expected reach in life. A love that, even if it wasn't born perfect, was capable of healing, sustaining, and continuing. Because they understood everyone. It was not to stay by custom. It was to stay for real love. Decades later, one of Alexander's great-great-granddaughters, during an interview to enter the university, was asked for a life reference. Without hesitation, he answered, "My family," because when all seemed broken, they chose stay. And since there, they changed it everything. The interviewer, moved, asked him further details. She talked about the garden, the bench, the diary blue, but about everything, talked about how those decisions past still influenced in their own elections. "I don't know to love perfectly," he said, but I know that when love gets tough, I don't have to go out running. That phrase was left written in his form, and although it was not part of the evaluation, it was what most they remembered her, because pointed out a wisdom that few youths load so soon, to understand that true love is built, not inherited. At a school event, one of the further little ones in the family read in front of his class a text that had written for a task about heroes. Instead of choosing a comic book character, he talked about his great-great-grandfather Alexander. Because I thought that having success was being famous, but after learned that it was to care, to hug, and to be there. When she finished, the teacher cried, not for he text, but for what it represented. Because in a world where urgency, ego, and immediacy dominate, that child spoke of another thing, of presence, of transformation, of humility. And in that instant, it became clear that the story had not finished, that while someone more inspired to stay, to love different, to be repaired instead of breaking up, Alejandro and Carmen would continue alive, not in statues but in acts, in elections, in the way another family, in other place, decide today not to leave. One autumn afternoon, while golden leaves were falling in his center field, Diego sat alone in the wooden bench, closed the eyes and listened the sounds familiar, children's laughter, footsteps on gravel, the wind between the trees. In their lap had he diary blue, already worn out, but still full of life. Opened a random page and read in voice high, nobody is forced to stay, but who stays leaves footprint. He smiled. To his side, one young volunteer sat down and asked her by that continued coming. And Diego replied, because each time someone new arrives here, I remember that everything it was worth it, that the pain was transformed into something useful, that love, when it is real, expands. The young woman looked at him in silence, with respect, and he understood that this place was not a center community, it was a living heritage. That same one night, Mateo found in his mail a handwritten letter. I didn't have sender, just said, thank you for exist. Never the I. New, but changed my life. Inside there was a short story from someone who had abandoned to his daughter, and after reading We Stayed, there was decided look for her. Now I wrote from a new stage, with humility and hope. Mateo was moved, but not by the letter in yes, but because understood that each decision they made, since he moment in which Alexander cancelled that wedding, continued multiplying. It was an invisible network of acts brave, of hearts that chose repair, and he who knew that was the true legacy, not what they built, but what they inspired to others to build. Because in each history rescued, in each bond rebuilt, Alejandro and Carmen were living again, not as past, but as present continuous. In a year, end closing session, center coordinators community gathered to evaluate that there was worked and what could improve. One of them, a young man newly incorporated, raised his hand timidly and said, I didn't live through any of this. I arrived. But I feel like I belong, because you don't teach from history, they teach from the way they live. There was silence, warm in the room, and one of the grandchildren replied, that is the highest praise, that someone I arrived without knowing and still so understand. Because it was no longer just about remembering he passed, but of living he present with the themselves values. If you do not convert the memory in a museum, but in an engine, in a compromised diary, and everyone, at that moment, reaffirmed that they were not over there by tradition, they were there by choice. Like Alejandro, like Carmen, like everyone those who sometime they decided stay. That same day, they found in an old cupboard a cardboard box forgotten. Inside there was photographs never seen, letters that were never sent, and even drawings of the children when were small ones. Among the papers, there were a crumpled sheet with a unique phrase written by Alejandro. I wish I had realized it sooner, but at least I realized it. That phrase was framed and hung at the entrance to the garden. I don't eat reproach, but as consolation, because spoke of redemption late, yes, but also of possibility, that there is always a moment, for at least, to look again with new eyes, and that was the spirit that sustained all. Do not deny the errors, but transform them in paths. Do not hide the falls, but use them as steps. Because the love they built was not a perfect story. It was a true, conquered day by day, with intention and courage. During a visit guided with teenagers from a school public, a student raised her hand and asked with complete honesty, "And if one wants to meet but he other, has he already left?" The guide, one of the great-granddaughters, took some seconds and replied, "Then you are left with you. You learn to support yourself, to heal yourself, and with the time, perhaps no longer you." It hurt so much. That it happened gone. The girl nodded in silence, because not all stories could to repair like Alejandro and Carmen's, but yes, could inspire us not to break anymore, to take care of what's coming afterward, to take care of oneself. And that was another profound value of that legacy. It didn't promise happy endings, it promised paths further honest. And in a world saturated with appearances, that was almost a revolution. If you're reading this far, it's because something moved you. Prove it's worth it. Subscribe now. That night, while accommodated the halls for an event the next day, Diego stayed some minutes more, walking alone among the spaces. He looked at the photos, the banks, plants, everything that sometime it was just an idea, now it was reality. Closed the eyes and remembered the moment exact in which he saw by first time Alejandro cried, not out of rage, but out of understanding, out of tenderness, out of awakening. And he knew that even though time had passed, that image was what held everything. A powerful man, kneeling before 3 children, asking permission to be part of their lives. There was no speech that would surpass that. There was no construction further firm that surrender sincere. That's why followed there. That's why followed believing. Because love, when chosen thus, it is able to sustain generations whole. In the last page of a special reissue of the newspaper Blue, the family decided at a reflection collective written by all the grandchildren, we learned that it is not about saving he past, but to take care of he present, not to repeat he same pain. That staying is not always easy, but sometimes it is the only way to truly love. That we don't need heroes, only people who dare to return after failing. That edition sold out in weeks, not for marketing, but because every person who read it, I felt that in some way he was talking about her same. From a mistake that I wanted repair, of a bond that deserved other opportunity, of a piece of life that still I was in time to be rescued. Carlos, already with health problems, was interviewed by a journalist who wanted close a documentary about history. He asked her that title would give to everything he experienced. Carlos thought for a moment and replied, "A story that almost didn't happen." The journalist, intrigued, asked him to explain, and Carlos added, because one step less was enough, one missed call, one conversation avoided, and none of this there would be existed. That answer was left as closing of the documentary, and it was shared by the thousands, because he talked about how fragile everything is, about how sometimes an entire life depends on a moment of courage. Alejandro and Carmen did not change his world, but yes, changed his world, and that, in the end, was he change that most resonated, because it was real, it was intimate, and it was chosen. At the ceremony, commemorative by the 100 years after Alexander's birth, already with several generations present, one of the great-great-granddaughters read a text that had written especially for the occasion. I didn't know my great-grandfather, but path about what he chose rebuild. My family is my map, and every time I sit down lost, I think, what would do someone who chose stay? His words generated silence charged with emotion, because it was no longer just about memory, but about direction, about knowing how to where go when all seems confusing. In the faces of the attendees, there were pride, but also humility, because they knew that each one had to continue choosing every day, that the legacy, not them, exempted them from making mistakes. It only gave them further tools to repair, and that, in such a large family, it was more valuable than any material inheritance. At the end of the ceremony, everyone were invited to plant a new tree, not in replacement of the previous one, but as continuation. Each person wrote a word in a ribbon and tied it to the stem: young, perseverance, listen, seconds opportunities, courage, real love. Carmen and Alejandro were no longer physically, but its roots followed growing, not underground but in the decisions, daily routines of each descendant, in how they resolved the conflicts, in how they hugged their children, in how they asked sorry. And seeing that new tree, everyone they understood that history was not an endpoint, it was a seed eternal, one that flourished one and the other time in each act of tenderness, in each conversation difficult held with respect, in each promise not to repeat abandonment, because to stay, they knew well, is a decision that is made all the days. In one of the many workshops that were taught in her center community, an older woman asked to speak. There was state in silence the whole session, but at the end he said, "I left. It's been many years, and today I'm here to see, it is still possible return." Nobody judged her. Nobody asked her explanations. They simply surrounded her with a support round silent, because they understood that returning wasn't always literal. Sometimes it was a gesture, a message, an act of internal repair. That woman, that day, didn't resolve all his history, but he started walking it again, and that was enough. Because in We Stayed, there was no heroes infallible, nor movie endings, just people trying love better. And that, in the end, was what mattered most, was moving months later. That same women, he returned to the workshop with a letter in his hand. It wasn't for anyone in the room, but for your daughter, whom there was not yet had the courage to contact. He read it in voice tall, trembling. "I don't know. I deserve you, sorry, but wanna try it." When he finished, there was silence, and then a soft, sincere applause. No one knew his daughter would answer, but everyone they knew something was changed, because the act of writing, of naming, of exposing oneself, was already a way back. And that was what the center community continued teaching, day after day, that staying is not always means be present physically, sometimes means not to give by defeated, hold the door open, keep hope alive. Carlos passed away in peace, surrounded by his family in a serene spring afternoon. At his farewell, there was no long speeches nor tributes sumptuous, only readings of excerpts from the diary blue, songs that the triplets had children's song, and a last phrase written in a blackboard next to the coffin. "Thank you for stay, even though you didn't know how." It was the closure of a generation that had given everything it had to repair a fracture, and at the same time, it was the beginning of another stage. Because what Carlos, Diego, Mateo, and so many more, what they built, was not just a home, but a method, a language, a new way of teaching what it means be there, be present, be part, heal. With his departure, many they feared that the center community lost his essence. But the opposite happened. New voices emerged, new leaderships were formed. The message continued untouched because it wasn't anyone's property. It was a way of looking at life. And so, every meeting, each workshop, each hug held was a loving repetition of the first. Decision Alexander's brave, cancel a wedding to embrace his true, close a stage of success empty, to start one of imperfect love. What began as a revenge term as a redemption, and that redemption, generations then, it continued transforming hearts. I don't eat history ancient, but as live act, like a proof daily that there is always, always something worthwhile stay. Every year, On the date in which it would have been celebrated, that wedding, the family organizes a day of reflection, open to the public, not as a commemoration of what was not, but as a reminder of what is it happened, the beginning of a transformation. During that day, the doors of the center are open all the time, are offered activities, are shared stories, and are invited to visitors to write in a special wall called the Wall of Those Who Stayed Behind. There, with colored markers, people leave names, phrases, dates, promises. And that wall, each time further full, has become in a silent testimony to the power of a decision, how an act of courage can generate thousands more, how to a family, when facing his truth, he taught to others to do the same. And so, the story of Alejandro Hernandez and Carmen Garcia did not end with them, nor with their children, nor with their grandchildren. It lives on in every person who, after failing, chooses try again. In each conversation difficult that cannot be avoided, in each sorry offered without guarantees, in every hug that is given even when there is fear. Because they understood everyone. It's not about not leaving. It's about coming back with awareness. It's about loving with intention. It's about looking at the other with their mistakes and wounds and saying, I want be with you. And that, more than a happy ending, is the most honest that can have any history. If you made it this far, subscribe. This story, it's already part of you. And yet, there is many more to come.